welcome back to the Dan Cave, back for part 2 of the Great Wall Hobbies 144th scale Victor. And it's pretty much straight into the action on the wings this time. And by the end of this video, we'll have the wings attached to the fuselage. So the construction of the wing starts with getting all the necessary parts off the sprues, tidying up all those gates around the wing components. And with the top wing pieces, one of the parts I'm always conscious of is both parts have a pitot tube at the wingtip, and well, I am notorious for knocking them off during the build phase, so extra care will be done there. Each wing has a fuel tank underneath, and each fuel tank is made up of 2 parts. So these are cleaned up and glued together straight away, because the sooner these get set, the sooner they can be cleaned up and ready to attach. So the remaining parts of the wing are removed from the sprue and also cleaned up. The gates on this kit are actually quite thick, and as we'll see later on, that is one of the reasons I end up with a little bit of filling work to do on the fuel tanks and the refueling pods, because the gates were quite thick, and cleaning them up I did actually end up making a small gap. So here I'm just about ready to remove the refueling pods from the sprues and begin assembling them. Each refueling pod's made up of 2 halves basically, and then there's a tiny little part which inserts into the back of the pod. I guess that's there to simulate the actual the basket that comes out when it's deployed in flight. So they are left on the sprue for the moment, so I can do the cleanup on the main parts and get those components glued together. So as I mentioned earlier, it's here where the sprue gates are quite noticeably thick and kind of don't sit flush with the mating surface. So when you're cleaning up that sprue gate off of the mating surface, or at least when I was doing it, it's very easy to take away a little bit too much plastic and leave yourself a small bit of a gap to fill, which ultimately I think I ended up doing on both refueling pods and both fuel tanks for under the wing. Again, it's one of those areas where it's a small little gap to fill, but you know, with better cleanup, it would have been avoidable, because actually the fit on this kit is absolutely brilliant. A very pleasing kit to work with. I do have one of the Great Wall Hobby Victor, Vulcan kits in the stash as well, and that'll be built up probably over the coming months, as well as I want to build all 3 of the V bombers in 144th scale. So it'll be interesting to see if the kit quality is as good on the Vulcan as well. So for these components, these are glued together using Tamiya Extra Thin, basically just holding the parts together and running some extra thin along the join area, and that'll, by capillary reaction, just seep straight into that little gap. And hopefully, if you find the plastic reacts well, and you get a tiny little bit of molten plastic kind of comes out from the joint, this, of course, helps clean up as well, so you don't have an obvious kind of seam line in that area. So one of the little jobs I've done as well, which you can see just above my right hand, is the parts that go inside the wing. So there's basically an upper and lower intake for each wing, which provides the intakes for the 2 engines on each side. At the back of them, there's a little fan inlet, and then at the rear of the wing, there's 1 exhaust per engine. So all these parts need to be painted up before the wing is assembled together. So all those parts have been removed from the sprue as required and ready for airbrushing. So here we are starting the airbrushing of the intake components. So as I said, there's an upper and lower, and from reference pics they look to be a white or light grey, so I've chosen to paint them, I think it was Vallejo matte white, just putting down quite even light coats just to build up that white colour. It does go on well against that background of the light grey plastic. So that's done for all four. So now we're on to using some Ammo MIG burnt iron, and that'll be used for the exhausts, for the 4 exhausts from one per engine. So don't need much paint on these. I decided not to prime them as they're going to be inside the wings. They're not going to be touched. They're not going to be handled much. So they'll be put inside and probably masked up when we get to the painting stage. So one of the difficult bits is obviously getting paint down into the exhaust, but actually they're quite small and actually quite difficult to see into. So even if it's not complete coverage, as long as that burnt iron gives that effect of kind of a dark, the dark recesses of an old turbojet engine. So again, with the Ammo MIG, it's important to do multiple light passes. Sometimes actually doing quite a light dusting pass from a distance quite good, because it gives quite a dry surface for the Ammo MIG paint to adhere better to. But build it up slowly. You can use the air alone from the airbrush just to dry those parts in between passes, and it will flash over pretty quickly. I do find with the Ammo MIG paint, sometimes it can be quite slow drying, particularly the metallics. Certainly, for at least 24 hours afterwards, you can still get a whiff of the solvent in there. But in this case, they seem to be okay. So now we're on to the final little bit of painting for parts that go inside the wing, and that's for the engine fan inlets. They're going to be painted in Ammo MIG polished metal. So again, that's going to be a couple of drops into the airbrush, and for all these parts I'm using the Harder Steenbeck Infinity. I think it's a 0.4 needle is in it. So yeah, so we're just checking that sprays correctly, which it does. And again, we'll just do a couple of drops of paint into the paint cup. 5-6 drops, not a huge amount of paint really. And then it'll be a couple of reasonably thin light passes. You don't want to flood this on, you want to give it a chance to dry. So again, these will sit at the back of the intakes and are fairly hidden from sight once they're in there, but you might be able to catch a glimpse of them if you look more closely. But it doesn't take much to cover these parts. So that's it for painting those components, and now it's on to cleaning up the seam lines on the fuel tank. And as you can see, I'm using I think that's a UMP thinny stick. I can't remember which grit, but it's medium grit. Run it over the edge. I'm using a Tamiya panel line scriber just to reinsert that panel line detail. So I'll go back over some of the bits with a sponge sander just to make sure everything's okay. And it's around this point that I realised that actually there is a small gap which will need to be addressed. But there is some panel line detail on these fuel tanks, and you just want to make sure that that's back in place after the sanding is done. The same process is then followed on the refueling pods. So it's a thinny stick from UMP followed by the sponge sander, which again, it's fairly used, so it's not quite as coarse as it used to be. So actually produces quite a reasonable finish, which the primer will cover up. So now, after putting those parts together and cleaning them up, it's the realization that there's a couple of small gaps that need a little bit of filling. So to do this, I grab a metal spatula carving tool and some Revell model filler. I do like the Revell model filler. It seems to adhere well to styrene and sands pretty smooth and flush. And generally, I found that the primers do cover it up quite well. So I just put a little bit out on a little piece of card. Take a small amount on the filling tool and just start pushing it into the gap and smooth it down as much as possible. It's a good idea to leave a little bit kind of prey out of the surface because you will get a little bit of shrinkage as it dries. So it's always worth having something that's worth kind of sanding away rather than putting completely too little on and then having to add more filler if it shrinks and leaves a gap. So on both fuel tanks, the gaps were on the upper forward part, so it's actually quite visible because it sits ahead of the leading edge on the wings, so any gap would have been quite visible. On the refueling pods, it was on the underside, so less noticeable, but the filler is out, so it's worth doing at this stage. With thin coats of this filler, generally they can be dry in at least an hour, but if it's any major filling operation, you really need to give them 24 hours. Now, in part one, I did mention that the nose had a little bit of a step in it that needed filling. And seeing as I had the filler out, I thought, well, I'll just go in and just add a little bit of filler to that area, cover that up. And again, I'll be able to come back to that in a couple of hours and remove the excess and get that nice and smooth. So the paint on the intakes is dry. I'm now removing a little bit of overspray from the edges where they'll be glued together. Paint went down pretty okay. Could have probably given another couple of coats, but I think some of the intake will be covered with the exterior paint, as mainly the back end of it that'll be white. It's not going to be that visible on this scale, so it should give a suitable kind of white effect once they're glued together and placed inside the wing root. I was tempted to use one of the older style tube glues for this because it can actually help fill gaps a little bit. But the locating tabs were quite firm and they went together quite well, so I actually decided against it. On reflection, it may have been a better idea because there is actually quite a noticeable seam line, which seems to appear on the inside. But we'll deal with that a little bit later on. That'll also get some filler added to it a little bit later. So parts are squeezed together just to make sure they stay nicely squeezed together with the glue added. I just grab a couple of pegs, which will be used to keep it shut, and I'm going to run some Tamiya extra thin along the joint. The capillary action of the extra thin, of course, will go nicely in along that joint and give a good kind of firm gluing surface to both sides. It will, of course, be trapped within the wing root, so there's not really much chance of that coming apart again. So these parts will be pegged together, left to sit for a couple of hours for that Tamiya extra thin to set properly. We'll do the same on both sides. So it's the same process again. The mating surfaces have been cleaned up a little bit of Tamiya extra thin across the join. Just let that run nicely into that joined area. Press them reasonably firmly together, try and get at least some of that molten plastic. That might help the gap that was apparent. Because of the shape of the intake, that gap on the inside is actually reasonably visible. We'll come back and look at that later. So the exhausts are basically one exhaust per engine, all molded in one piece, and they just pop nicely into little locating tabs on the trailing edge. So they've been popped on with no adhesive, and I think the best thing to do is just run a little bit of Tamiya extra thin in around the locating tabs. Of course, once the wings are mated together, those parts aren't going anywhere. There is a locating point on the upper side as well. That, of course, will be done on both wings. Same process for the other side. Just a little bit of Tamiya extra thin in around that join. That'll be absolutely perfect. Looking at the way they actually protrude from the trailing edge, it may be a tricky masking job a bit later on. We'll see how that turns out in one of the later parts. But certainly it'll be easy enough to mask the inside. A little bit of foam or sponge will go inside, and that will cover up the insides quite well. But it's just there's a little bit of a lip of the exhaust sits outside of the kind of wing main surface, so that'll need to be masked somehow to make sure that we can paint the appropriate upper and lower wing colors. So them parts look good, all nicely secured. So here's where I finally do use a little bit of tube glue, just to attach the intakes, just a little drop on each of the locating tabs. In some cases, Tamiya extra thin can be hard to get down at these kind of tabs because they are quite buried. So that the standard tube glue works fine. There's nowhere for it to squeeze out. It's not going to be visible. But I will run some Tamiya extra thin just along where the kind of leading edge of the intake, where that attaches to the leading edge of the wing, and that'll give a nice firm join between the intake and the wing leading edge structure. Of course, the fan intakes have been added to the back of the intake section. That was done with just a little bit of extra thin around the outside. But for this, I use a little bit of tube glue again on same as the other side. A little bit of a drop on each locating point. Pop the intake in. The fit on this has been absolutely excellent. There's barely a join at that leading edge part. We just let it run in. So now let's just speed things up a little bit. This is just a case of running extra thin around the two halves of the wing, around all the mating surfaces, and everything just goes together very, very cleanly and smoothly. No real issues there whatsoever. Let that to set, and then we can come back to it and begin the cleanup process. So this part has been sped up because this is fairly standard stuff. Get those sanding sticks out, clean off the excess around any of the mating surfaces, and then just get the sponge sander over to smooth it off. So now the intake area is one area of problems. So all I've done is basically glued a little bit of 600 grit sandpaper to a cocktail stick, and that gives me a little bit of a round sanding edge to get inside that intake area and try and improve the look of that seam line. Because of the shape of the intakes, it is quite visible. So I actually decided I need to go back and use some filler on those areas. Same process as before, a little bit of filler. I do spot a few other little areas that need a tiny little drop of filler in them, on the exhaust mainly, but it's mainly on the intakes. So now I go back and start removing the previously applied filler to the fuel tanks and the refueling pods. Most of this work is done with a thinny stick, the sponge sander, and then in some cases a run over with a buffer just to clean everything up. So the fuel tanks are now looking good and cleaned up. Check on all those panel lines, make sure they're there. Extra thin, stick it to the underside of the wing. Very simple process. The fit is absolutely excellent, no real problems there. And then I can do the same, of course, with the refueling pods, put them in place, and the little bit of extra thin, run it through, check on any of the previously kind of filled bits, make sure it's all right, and it looks good. So now that filler in the intake area has been left to set, I come back with the little cocktail stick with some sandpaper on it. I begin to remove any of the excess, and this actually improves the look of that intake area significantly. It just takes your eye away from that nasty seam line that was in there. So using a little bit of water as is wet and dry sandpaper, that helps stop it clogging. Go back in, again clean up any of the panel lines that are in that area. And of course I can go back and clean up any of the little filled spots that I found. So there was a couple on the leading edge. And so that's it. That's pretty much the wings together. There are some smaller components, but they'll be left until a little bit later. So because of the big flat mating surface on the wing root, I actually use a little bit of standard tube glue just to provide a nice good base for the two flat surfaces to adhere to. We start off with the left wing, and that slots straight in. The No obvious big gaps around it. The alignment looks good. It sits solidly. There's a little bit of glue came out, so just use a cocktail stick just to run that little bit of excess around the joint. And then just to make sure it's good and strong, I'm just going to run a little bit of extra thin around that outside edge of where that wing joint is. I don't think any filler or cleanup is going to be needed on these wing roots. They look absolutely fantastic. Those parts sit in very, very firmly and very cleanly. So then it's going to be the exact same process on the right wing. A little bit of standard tube glue on the flat mating surface. Get that wing lined up, slot it straight in. once again, get a little bit of Tamiya extra thin, run it around that join area. Do the upper skin and the lower skin as well. And that's it, both wings are on. So all the smaller kind of intakes and stuff like that is left off. We'll do that in the next part, as well as probably the horizontal tail plane. Begin prep on the canopy glass. But these are the kind of major structural components of the model all put together. And then it's just a quick alignment check on the vertical tail plane. I'm going to use a little set square for that, and that's it. That's part 2 complete. So I'll see you all in part 3.